Affiliated Society, we organize reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 1930s, the new 1960s to 1970s, and post-political 1980s to 1990s left for the possibility of emancipatory politics today. So this panel is one of our 4 public panels for the 2021 Platypus International Convention. The theme of the convention this year is the platypus synthesis, and this was the same theme as our 3rd international convention a decade ago in 2011. We had yesterday's panel, The Legacy of Trotskyism, and today we have the panel, The Politics of Critical Theory. These were both first staged at that 3rd convention in 2011. What has changed in the decade interval? Our first panel for the convention this year, From Protest to Politics, What Was the Millennial Left, took place last Sunday, March 28th, and sought to pose the question of the trajectory of the millennial left from the anti-war movement to the present. In a similar vein, our closing panel, The Death of the Millennial Left, scheduled for this Friday, April 9th, will pose the question once more, featuring members of Platypus who are engaged in the various phases of the millennial left's history as panelists. For more information about this year's convention, please visit our website at platypus1917.org and click the banner at the head of the page. On our site, you can also find a reading group near you, check out the latest from our publication, The Platypus Review, or visit other events from Platypus's 15-year history. Alternatively, you can find information about the convention on Facebook by searching for the Platypus Affiliated Society and checking out our event schedule. Be sure to RSVP for our final panel next week. And if you'd like to watch past panels, recordings are available on the Platypus Affiliated Society YouTube channel. Links to these resources should be shared in the chat. And at the end of the panel, we will have a post-panel discussion on Zoom. All attendees and participants are welcome to attend. All right, to get into the panel, just a reminder, the panel will be 10-minute opening remarks from everyone, followed by 3-minute responses from everyone where you can respond to other panelists' remarks. And then the rest of the time will be for question and answer. The panel will be 120 minutes in total, so panelists, please don't leave early, and please don't answer questions asked via the text box until the moderator reads them aloud. Yeah, thank you all, and now I'll list our speakers and discuss the prompt. So for our speakers, we have Dennis Kramer of the Association for the Design of History, Doug Lane, who is the host of Zero Books podcast, Douglas Kellner, a professor at UCLA and author of Herbert, Marcuse, and the Crisis of Marxism. We have Chris Cutrone, who is a founding member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. The prompt for today. For many on the left, the Sanders and Corbyn campaigns and the coinciding growth of the DSA and Momentum between 2015 and 2020 posed an opportunity for a revitalization of the left. Following the failure of these campaigns, there has been a resurgence of interest in the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, amidst a reconsideration of goal, strategy, and direction. However, there was historically some contention within critical theory over the applicability of Marxist theory to the moment. This manifested in a dispute in the late 60s between Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse over the efficacy of contemporary political action in the absence of a socialist party. What then is the political role of critical theory for the left today? How did the practice and theory of Marxism, from Marx to Lenin, make possible and necessary the politics of critical theory? How does our moment differ or remain the same from the one in which critical theory emerged? And we'll just go in the order of the panelists as I presented them. So Dennis, if you want to begin.
Okay, so the panel is called Politics of Critical Theory, and I think I will just begin with a provocation and say that I think that what we need today is not really like a politics of critical theory, but instead politics of Marxism. So first, for everyone to get on the same page, when we talk about critical theory in this context, we don't mean like the broader term that is often employed in the American or also British discourse, but we refer to the Frankfurt School. So basically Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, maybe Erich Fromm also, these kind of characters. And I think that one of the most important aspects of critical theory, especially in the Adorno Horkheimer like current, is the separation of theory and practice. And also, I think that's connected in some way with a strong emphasis on what has been called the subjective factor, consciousness, and a criticism of what they call like vulgar materialism, which are points that basically go back to Lukács and his history and class consciousness. And even though I think that critical theory has provided us with many important insights, especially with regard to the theory of fascism, what we can observe here is some kind of deviation from the original Marxism. And the critical task today is therefore to recover the proper materialist understanding of Marx, Engels, and Luxemburg. Okay, so what does this mean? I mean, most leftists today seem to subscribe to the belief that theory is like the prime mover of class struggle, and that the problem with our current situation is that people are not radical enough, that they are caught up in some democratic socialist or social democrat illusions, and that the lack of theoretical insight in the left and the masses is basically the reason why things don't move in our direction. So that like basically we have to just educate the people maybe and make them understand that they have to not just fight against like for like some small trade unionist gains or like a little bit more minimum wage, but that they should strive for socialism. And I think that this is a rather misguided view of what is actually happening. So while for Marx, being determines consciousness, for like the majority of the contemporary left, according to this prevalent view I described before, consciousness determines being. So basically, let's do it like this. I will quote Chris Cutrone, who said that there is no labor movement without the struggle for socialism. And what we at ADH would say is, no, it's the opposite. There is no struggle for socialism without the labor movement, so that the material base of society and the development of class struggle determines the prevailing ideas that people hold or people can hold. It would be futile to just try to like change people's ideas. Marx called this Bewusstseinskritik in his German ideology, so criticism of consciousness, which he like makes fun of and says that no, don't these people understand that consciousness arises from material conditions, that it's not just something you can criticize and then suddenly things change. So the struggle for socialism has to be understood, this would be our point, as a certain phase or stage of development of the labor movement. So to quote Marx, the proletariat goes through various stages of development. With its birth begins its struggle with the bourgeoisie. Okay, so the basic like existence of the proletariat as an economic class already, as a class like in itself already implies that it's in a precarious relationship with the bourgeoisie. And this is like the basic insight of Marxism, that this kind of objective opposition has to be accelerated in a way which leads to the struggle for socialism. Okay. Now, the struggle for socialism is basically only possible if the proletarian struggle in its immediate for its immediate economic interests has reached a certain stage of development. So we have to view it like a dynamic process, a process which can, like by some contingencies, be like held back or even retarded in a way that the development stage like goes down, but it can also be accelerated in the way that the class struggle gains intensity. So it's like it's an objective thing. It's not just something that's dependent on the ideas that we as leftists spread. It's something that's out there in society. Okay. So what does it mean concretely? I will shortly talk about 4 points. First point is the practical experience of opposition. So let's say some workers in the factory or like in a media company or whatever, they unite to fight for better wages or shorter working hours or some other working conditions improvement. This will give them in their struggle a practical opposition between their collective interest and the company they are working for, so that the relationship between proletariat and bourgeoisie becomes something that can be like immediately apprehended in this struggle, whereas before they didn't even maybe think about it. But if they start to fight for their interests, this opposition is something they subjectively experience. Secondly, the building of solidarity, which comes with this collective organization. Thirdly, the emergence of organizations, so basically labor unions, which can either be like gain new vitality, or you just found new organizations, depends on the situation. And fourth, the fighting spirit of the masses, their confidence in their ability to win, which is necessary for accelerating this kind of class struggle process. All of those things can only develop through struggle, and specifically through victory in struggle. Even if those victories are just like purely trade unionist, that is non-socialist victories, they will still accelerate this objective tendency of class struggle. So Luxemburg wrote about this: every new onset and every fresh victory of the political struggle is transformed into a powerful impetus for the economic struggle, extending at the same time its external possibilities and intensifying the inner urge of the workers to better their position and their desire to struggle. The workers' condition of ceaseless economic struggle with the capitalists keeps their fighting energy alive in every political interval. It forms, as to speak, the permanent fresh reservoir of the strength of the proletarian classes, from which the political fight ever renews its strength. So we should also not think that there's like the purely trade unionist economic struggle, and then there's the political struggle for socialism. They form a continuum of like a development of the class, basically the class struggle, whereas class consciousness is like an emanation from this development of class struggle. So there is, in this, to use the language of cybernetics, a positive feedback loop between victory, working class strength, and more victory. The principal task of the left would then be to help kickstart this positive feedback loop. So what does it mean in practice? Like, I mean, okay, it sounds good in theory, but what does it mean in practice? In practice, it means that we must engage not in propaganda, but in agitation and practical support. So our goal is not to make everyone a Marxist immediately, but to help the workers win, which will create the material basis of like everything that is to follow. We cannot just like at the current situation where the working class is really like destroyed by neoliberalism, where there's no real organization and stuff like this, we cannot just demand that everyone should be a Marxist. We must first, like we as Marxists must intervene in these struggles, try to get them to a point where they gain this self-accelerating dynamic. And this is like what we have to do. Okay, so to quote Lenin, what we have to do is we must soberly follow the actual state of the class consciousness and preparedness of the entire class, not just its communist vanguard, and of all the working people, not only their advanced elements. So basically, like revolutionary socialism is the necessary consciousness of the proletariat in class struggle at a certain stage, which means this would be like my final point, that the left now has to found organizations of organizers, like trade union organizers. And we shouldn't fall into the pitfall of either saying, oh, we do trade unionism for its own sake, and we are just like opportunists who just try to improve the situation of the working class a little bit, or we are revolutionists who immediately like advocate or propagandize for like expropriating the means of production, stuff like this. But we have to view it as a material process of building class solidarity and building like the proletariat from a class for itself into from a class in itself into a class for itself. And I think this is like the basic strategic task of the left right now. And it requires some kind of abandonment of the, I would say, idealism that is implicit in like critical theory. We have to go back to a more properly Marxist, materialist understanding of class struggle and the role of consciousness with regard to the struggle and the primacy of the material, like development of the class. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Dennis. And we'll move on to Doug Lane.
Okay, can you hear me now? All right. So what I'm going to do is reflect the atomization of the left by telling my own story. Usually when I'm listening to a panel like this and someone starts by talking about themselves, I tune them out. So I hope people won't be tuning me out. But I want to push against the idea that critical theory is newly of interest to the left. And I would actually say, I think it's really difficult to say what is the major trend on the left right now, or maybe overall outside of major crises. So like, it would be a major trend on the left to be concerned about Greece at a certain point, or be a major trend to be upset about a foreign war. But what theoretical apparatus people are turning to understand these things is not, it's impossible to say in a lot of ways. So I came to critical theory through a podcast. I started podcasting in 2009. It was after the economic crisis. I was a struggling writer working at a Comcast call center and discovered that podcasts exist. But when I won an iPod in a sales contest, and so decided I would start a podcast. And when I started out, and I'd been a science fiction writer and some kind of weird leftist for a long time. I had run a Fish for President in 1992 on the random surrealist ticket. No one noticed, but I had made some little pamphlets and zines about it. And my politics was eclectic. It was weird, subjectivist, anarchist in a way, influenced by the Situationists. But when the 2008 crisis came along, I realized I didn't have a good understanding of how society worked, that the politics that I had embraced were not of much use. I was worried about having a job, and also whether or not the New York publishing world would just evaporate. And so I started a podcast and started interviewing Marxists, and also, but it's important to note, also like psychedelic warriors and new age gurus and liberal journalists and just an array of people who had any kind of vision for a different society. And my thinking then was that like some of these weird fringe groups that existed, like the psychedelic community, were really coming out of the left anyway, that they were like what happened to a utopian drive after the failure of the 60s. And so I was somewhat consciously trying to reintroduce Marx, or not Marx, but at least anti-capitalism to these kinds of people. But after a while, I became interested in critical theory. I studied philosophy in college as an undergraduate, and I realized that the kind of interviews I was doing weren't particularly helpful, that I needed to go deeper. And I read Slavoj Žižek, and I read Althusser, and I read and talked to Andrew Kleiman, and eventually joined the Marxist Humanist Initiative for a little while. And at that point, I thought that the key to was understanding not the culture, but political economy. And I should point out that, like, just to defend myself for having this sort of idealist conception of society, if you look to someone like Grace Lee Boggs, who was a member of the Forrest Johnson or the Johnson Forrest Tendency, friends with CLR James, and wrote some very serious work on state capitalism. By 2012, she was sounding not that different from a New Ager herself. There's a conversation with her and Angela Davis where she said, what the left needs to do now is study our own interior life and I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but change our attitudes. But so, I mean, we were up against it well before 2008, ideologically, or the way in our own self-conception. Certainly in the Pacific Northwest, we were, but I was satisfied at that time to just try to reconceive of what the struggle for socialism was about, and what needed to be changed, and how capitalism worked, and what society was. But then when Trump was elected, the fact that these ideas no longer had a political form that could be recognized in the world. It seemed to be really consequential, and there was a feeling like, okay, we have to hurry up and develop a politics. And the only thing that was there was like the Sanders campaign and the DSA. And I didn't join the DSA, and I was not fully on board with Sanders, but I wasn't completely allergic to that turn either. And in the meantime, I'd started being the publishing manager at Zero Books, so my little podcast had landed me a job. So I thought that during the Trump years, the key was now to understand how this capitalism that I thought of in terms of the categories of from Marx and capital, how they became, how the capital became political, like what, and this was, or how it shaped our politics. So still like thinking in this linear way, like, okay, there's capitalism, there's the base, and then it does something and creates the superstructure. And then the superstructure rotates around and creates capital. Probably the truth is that politics come first in that chain in a sense, but also, but out of a different material base. And anyway, the point is it's not very simple to understand how political economy creates our culture. But that's what I think critical theory is about. Like, I think critical theory is about being exactly in that position that I was in. Only maybe, you know, people like Kramer and Adorno were much smarter and much more engaged, but nonetheless, being in this position of failure and trying to understand how the system of capitalist production, the life that generates, is maintaining itself, and what has happened to socialism, what has happened to even the bourgeois project of human emancipation. So that's what I feel like we're still trying to do at Zero Books. I don't think that it's different. The project is fundamentally different today than it was when Trump was elected, although the left is what is out there as the left that deludes itself into thinking it is the form that theory is taking in action. That's changed. The letters between Adorno and Marcuse are really interesting because you can see that they had a left that was a little bit better than the one we have now. I don't think Marcuse would be arguing with Adorno if he was writing to Adorno today about something similar at the university. There wouldn't be any question or terms to argue around that the students like deserve to be kicked out of the room. I don't think that there would be a debate there. That the new left was better than what we have today for some reason. We should probably think about that. But so I'm feeling like I'm very much sounding like a Platt here. I want to point out that I'm not a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society, and the reason I want to point that out is because I do think that one of the risks that we run when we try to conceive of a new party form, or when we can try to conceive of a politics, is that we will leave out understanding that material base of society and working through the way it functions and bringing our understanding of both the politics and the material base together and seeing their interaction is still what I think the task of critical theory is today, and it's unfinished. And I don't know if I've talked for 10 minutes or not, but I'll stop there.
Thanks, Doug. And we'll move on to Doug Kellner.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I was asked to speak on the relationships of Karl Korsch and Herbert Marcuse to Marxism. And in particular, I was asked to address the issues raised for contemporary theory and politics in my books, Karl Korsch, Revolutionary Theory, and my other book, Herbert Marcuse and the Politics of Marxism. So basically that's what I'll talk about today, starting with Marxism. Ironically, or interestingly, my first teaching job was to teach philosophy at the University of Texas in Austin in 1973, and I was asked to teach Marxism. It was perhaps the only university in the United States, Texas, that had a position that required Marxism courses, etc. So that's where I landed in 1973, and I was hired there because I had had a German government fellowship and studied 2 years in Germany, including with Ernst Bloch. And I also spent a year in Paris afterwards using my paper out money. And I listened to the lectures of Foucault, of Levi-Strauss, of Derrida, of Jean Baudrillard. So I had basically 50 years of cultural capital from the critical theory and Marxism that I'd studied in Germany, and the French theory that turned out to be later called postmodern theory, that I wrote a trilogy of books on in the 1980s. So that is my background in academia. And when I was teaching Marxism at the University of Texas, I was into critical Marxism, or neo-Marxism, which was Georg Lukács, the Hungarian Marxist, Karl Korsch, the German Marxist, Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist, and then the Frankfurt School and critical theory, in particular, Marcuse and Adorno. Well, as it turned out, there were 3 books published at the time in the mid-70s when I was teaching Marxism on Lukács. My friend Carl Boggs was writing a big book on Gramsci. There were several books, Martin J. and others on the Frankfurt School. So I thought I'd do my first book on Karl Korsch. So I was having a meeting in 1975 with the head of the University of Texas Press, and they had just started a Marxism series of books, and gave me a contract to do Karl Korsch. So 2 years later, my first book, look at the nice red star, Karl Korsch, Revolutionary Theory, came out. Now, Korsch relates, he wasn't a member of the Frankfurt School. He was on the fringes of the Frankfurt School. He actually taught Marxism to Felix Weil, who funded the Frankfurt School. And as it turns out, both Marcuse and Korsch were, they hadn't met, but they were in the German Revolution of 1918 in different capacities. And both of them had to emigrate from Nazi Germany in the late 1930s. So they had some similarities, but also differences. Korsch was 10 years older than Marcuse. He was born in a rural village near Hamburg in 1886. He went to study philosophy. Both Marcuse and Korsch were philosophy students in Munich, Geneva, and Berlin universities. Korsch, though, decided to get his law degree in 1908 at Jena University, which was the same university that gave Karl Marx his doctoral dissertation in the 1840s. When Korsch was not involved with his studies, he was involved in the Free Student Group that was basically like SDS or the Occupy movement. It was sort of a radical student group trying to reform the university and society. He was head of the newspaper. He was leading a socialist speakers group that brought people like Edward Bernstein and Karl Liebknecht to the top Marxists of the time to lecture. So Karl Korsch was from his student days till his death an activist and a sort of revolutionary socialist or Marxist. Now, World War I erupted in 1914, so Korsch's student days were interrupted. And although Korsch was anti-war and a pacifist, he served in the war as a hospital orderly because he said he wanted to be with the masses. And in 1917, he joined the Independent Social Democratic Party that was a break-off left-wing split from the Social Democrat Party that supported the war, whereas Korsch didn't support the war. Well, near the end of the war, there was an uprising of soldiers and workers that Korsch participated in. He was a member of a soldiers' council that helped carry out with the Workers' Council the German Revolution of 1918 that basically chased the Tsar, the Kaiser out of Germany and instituted the democratic Weimar Republic. And during the Weimar Republic, Korsch was very much of a activist who was very heavily involved in German politics, first serving with the Independent Social Democrats, that was a very radical left-wing party. But then in a split, he joined briefly the Communist Party and became a minister of justice in the Turrington government in 1923, which is the same year he wrote his first book, Marxism and Philosophy, that stressed the Hegelian roots of Marxism, that it was a critical theory, that was a theory of liberation and emancipation, and he stressed the Hegelian roots of Marxism, as Marcuse would do later. Well, Korsch became then he became one of the first to criticize the Communist Party. He broke with Leninism, and Korsch's model for revolutionary socialism was the Workers' Councils group, the Soldiers and Worker Council group, Council Communism, it was called. It sounded a bit like Dennis was talking about autonomous groups, that Occupy movement all over the world that would basically organize for local issues of all kinds. And for the rest of his life, Korsch believed in council communism. In the 1930s, he wrote about the Spanish Civil War and the councils movement there. Actually, in Italy, there was also an uprising after World War I, and Antonio Gramsci was involved in council communism as well as Korsch. Well, Korsch, of course, became sort of a persona non grata with the political parties of Germany, since he attacked the Communist Party, he attacked the Social Democratic Party, he advocated a very left-wing view of revolution. So when Hitler and fascism rose to power, Korsch emigrated to the United States, where he became an independent socialist, writing on the Spanish Civil War and different revolutionary movements. So I published my book on Korsch. It was the first collection of his essays on practical socialism. He wrote essays, what is socialization? What does it mean to socialize the means of production? What is revolution? So he wrote on all the revolutionary movements and became one of the influences on the new left. By the way, did I go my whole 10 minutes on Karl Korsch? Let me do a minute or two on Herbert Marcuse. So Herbert Marcuse also participated in the German Revolution, but he got his doctoral dissertation in philosophy and then immigrated to the US because he was a German Jew, worked for the OSS and the American government against fascism in World War II, and then had an academic career where he became the spokesperson of the New Left and developed the notion of critical Marxism that I'll discuss in my next 3-minute session, since I went over my 10 minutes and I want to follow the protocol as the previous speakers. So we'll come back to Marcuse shortly.
Thanks, Doug. And now, Chris.
Okay, I'm going to present on the negative dialectic of Marxism, why Marxism was and must be dialectical, to demystify this word and specify it and its necessity for Marxism. What is the necessity of the dialectic for Marxism? It is of an essentially negative character. For instance, all degeneration of Marxism can be called undialectical, the abandonment of this essentially negative and dialectical character. The Frankfurt School thinker, Theodor Adorno, titled his last completed book, Negative Dialectic, and he thus sought to recapture this original sense of Marxism, which had been progressively abandoned in Adorno's lifetime in the 20th century. Moreover, as Adorno emphasized, the task is to, quote, think dialectically and undialectically at the same time, because getting beyond capitalism would mean getting beyond the dialectic, or as Adorno wrote, quote, no longer a totality nor a contradiction. Looking back upon the history of Marxism, there are 3 different moments for considering this problem. Marx's own formative moment of Marxism, the height of Marxism as a political force in the world in the time of Lenin, and the degeneration of Marxism into what Adorno called dogmatization and thought taboos. Our own moment today is the product of a century of such degeneration. By contrast, for Marx in his own time, the necessity of the dialectic was to be found in the self-contradictory character of not only capitalism, but of the struggle to overcome it in socialism. Marxism had its origins in the dialectical critique of capitalism, which also includes, at its core, the dialectical critique of socialism. It is significant that Marx and Engels began with the dialectical critique of the socialists and communists of their time, of the young Hegelians and of others such as Proudhon. In the subsequent height of Marxism as a political force, during Lenin's time, the proletarian socialist movement and its organized parties became self-contradictory, subject to a dialectic. For instance, as Rosa Luxemburg critiqued of reformist revisionism in Marxism, there was a contradiction between the movement and its goal, or between means and ends, which also involved a contradiction between practice and theory, etc. Lenin went so far as to say that this contradiction, division and split, within the workers' movement for socialism was what made political and social revolution possible and necessary. How was this so? First, it is necessary to address how Marx and Marxism understood capitalism as a problem to be overcome. What kind of society is capitalism from a Marxist perspective? Marx defined capitalism as a mode of production, as the contradiction of bourgeois social relations and industrial forces of production. This is the essential character of the dialectic for Marxism, from which several other contradictions can be derived. For instance, the contradiction between the bourgeois ideological superstructure of false consciousness and the socioeconomic base. There, Marx defined the contradiction as temporal and historical in nature. The ideological superstructure changes more slowly than the socioeconomic base. Bourgeois consciousness is of a historical and not class character in a sociological sense of a particular group of people. Bourgeois means urban in the original French, and workers as well as capitalists are bourgeois in the sense of not members of the traditional rural classes or castes of preceding agricultural civilization. Peasants, manorial lords, parsons of the parish church, guild craftsmen of the village, and traveling merchant traders serving the lord, etc. The new situation of society in the bourgeois epoch brought with it new forms of self-understanding that are well established and continue in capitalism, especially the autonomous individual as social subject of production and exchange. Another way of describing capitalism is the contradiction between social being and consciousness. For Marxism, this contradiction of capitalism began with the Industrial Revolution. The consciousness of participation in society, in practice and theory, is bourgeois, while its actual social being has become industrial. The most important bourgeois ideology for Marxism is the consciousness of the workers as subjects of bourgeois society. The proletariat is a peculiar term referring to how the working class retained its formal rights as bourgeois citizens, while substantially becoming expropriated of its property in its labor as a commodity, harking back to ancient Rome, to the ancient Roman class of proletari, citizens without property. The Marxist critique of bourgeois consciousness as ideology is in its self-contradictory character. Hence, what distinguishes the Marxist dialectic is its critical character, from which it is distinguished, for example, from the Hegelian dialectic, which is a description of bourgeois emancipation of free labor from slavery and caste constraint, the bourgeois revolution, became an affirmative dialectic unable to address the problem of capitalism after the Industrial Revolution. So the critical theory of Marxist politics, to invert the title of this panel discussion, is essentially its negative character, the self-negation of bourgeois society in the Industrial Revolution, in which, for example, bourgeois right became self-contradictory, self-undermining, and self-destructive in capitalism. It is important that most avowed Marxists today adopt Marxism in a false way as a positive theory, as a theory of what capitalism is, for example, rather than as Marx and original Marxism approached capitalism, which was as a contradiction and crisis of society, a contradiction of its self-understanding and self-consciousness. I mentioned, for instance, social being and consciousness. For Marxism, social being does not define consciousness in practice and theory, but rather consciousness, or bourgeois ideology as false consciousness, is contradicted by social being of industrial production in capitalism. The temporal and historical character of this is crucially important and usually neglected. From a Marxist perspective, bourgeois society was not capitalist, not self-contradictory from the beginning in the Renaissance and subsequent 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, but rather became so only in the 19th century after the Industrial Revolution, in Marx's own time. This means an essentially negative approach to history and capitalism. History and capitalism for Marxism does not unfold positively, as with Hegel, as the development of consciousness of freedom, but rather negatively, a broadening and deepening crisis of society, born of the essential contradiction of industrial forces of production against bourgeois social relations. Capitalism is not a form of society for Marxism, but rather a self-contradiction and crisis of society, of bourgeois society specifically. The history of capitalism was for Marxism that of the unfolding task of socialism. But for the last 100 years, the task of socialism was abandoned in favor of the mere denunciation of capitalism, which was thus accepted as a positive fact rather than regarded properly as a negative task, something to be overcome. Involved in this was a collapse of the original distinction Marxism made between bourgeois society and capitalism, an elision of the contradiction between industrial forces and bourgeois social relations of production. The bourgeois social relations for Marxism are those of labor, cooperative social production. As Marx early on described about alienation, that is, the self-estrangement of social relations in capitalism, social relations are not only between people in society, but also between humanity and nature, and our relations with ourselves. Marx added to this threefold character of bourgeois social relations a fourth dimension of alienation in capitalism, namely the estrangement of labor from capital as its product. So for Marxism, social relations in capitalism are phenomena of contradiction and crisis, and no longer primarily the constitutive dimensions of society, as they had been in bourgeois consciousness, for instance, for Locke, Rousseau, Adam Smith, Kant, Hegel, and others. For Marxism, capitalism is not really a mode of production, but the self-contradiction of the bourgeois mode of production, that is, of the cooperative social production through the social relations of labor as a commodity. Marx defined bourgeois society as commodity-producing society, a society of commodities that produce other commodities. Labor, and later in manufacture and industry, labor power and labor time, as a commodity produces other commodities. But in the Industrial Revolution, labor, including labor power and labor time, as a commodity, becomes divided against itself. It produces two opposed commodities: use values, whose consumption reproduces labor in society, and capital, as the objectification and alienation or self-estrangement of the social value of labor, which ends up contradicting and undermining the basis for the reproduction of labor in society, the social relations of cooperative production. Capital investment becomes divided between human labor and scientific technique in production. Marx called science and technology the general social intellect, which mediated social production in a fundamentally different way from that of individual human labor. Social cooperation in capitalism was mediated by capital, hence capitalism. And for Marxism as a form of Hegelianism, what mediates is also what embodies contradiction. What mediates also contradicts. So capital contradicts social cooperation, but also social cooperation, the bourgeois social relations of labor as a commodity, contradict capital. Hence, the class struggle of the workers as subjects of social cooperation versus the capitalists as stewards of the social value of accumulated labor in capital. Labor and capital confront each other as aspects of social self-contradiction. Capital is the self-contradiction of labor, and labor is the self-contradiction of capital in industrial production. The workers' demand for the value of their labor in capitalism is historically regressive in that it seeks to restore the value of labor as a commodity that industrial production has contradicted and undermined. However, although the workers demand the reconstitution of the social value of labor as a commodity, and thus the reconstitution of bourgeois society, this is also the inevitable form in which the demand for socialism will be manifested. Socialism will inevitably be posed as the restoration of society in bourgeois terms, that is, in terms of the social relations of labor. This means that the workers' struggle for socialism is inherently self-contradictory. It is divided and indeed torn between the contradictory impulses to restore and reconstitute labor, as well as to transcend labor as a social relation and value. In the crisis of Marxism itself, that came at the end of the First World War, as the cataclysmic culmination of the Second Industrial Revolution, there was a division between the old socialist and new communist parties over the issue of whether and how to save society from the devastation of war and political and social collapse, and to revolutionize it beyond capitalism. There was an actual civil war within Marxism in the revolution that unfolded from 1917 to 1919. One side defended the working class as it existed in capitalism, while the other sought to overcome it. Socialism itself became divided between the interests of the workers. The anti-communists considered revolution to be a threat above all to the working class itself. The socialist political party that had been built up to overcome capitalism became its last bulwark of defense. The power to overthrow and smash the capitalist state proved to be the power to save it. And both sides claimed not only to represent the true interests of the working class, but also the ultimate goal of socialism itself. Both had right on their side, at least apparently. This was the most powerful demonstration of the dialectic ever in world history. And that is entirely appropriate since the Marxist dialectic was designed to address precisely this problem, as it had first manifested in the workers' movement for socialism in the 1840s and the revolutions of 1848, repeating itself on a higher level and in more drastic and dramatic and violent form in the revolutions of 1917 to 1919, and the division of Marxism between the parties of the old socialist Second and new communist Third Internationals. But this political conflict within the Marxist-led workers' movement was not a de novo phenomenon, but had long historical roots, which pointed to the development of contradictions within Marxism itself. This demanded a dialectical critique, a Marxist critique of Marxism itself. Just as Marx had engaged in the dialectical critique of the socialism and communism of his time, so Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, and other radical revolutionaries in the Second International engaged in the dialectical critique of their own Marxist socialist movement. Later, Trotsky engaged in the dialectical critique of Stalinism. In subsequent history, successive generations' rediscovery of Marxism was the rediscovery of the dialectic, which, however, proved ephemeral and elusive and fragile as a red thread that had been lost, broken many times. This tradition of negative dialectical critique was carried on by the Frankfurt School under the rubric of critical theory. As I already mentioned, including Adorno's magnum opus, Negative Dialectic, but also Horkheimer and Adorno's Dialectic of Enlightenment, etc. But the dialectic fell out of style in the 20th century, with Marxism itself rendered undialectical, and discontents of the failure of Marxism blaming the dialectic for the impasse of Marxism. Undialectical Marxists made explicit return to pre-critical, indeed pre-Socratic philosophy, such as Althusser and his followers. Postmodernists such as Foucault rejected the grand narrative of history as the struggle for freedom. Unable to grasp the nature and character of the dialectic at a standstill in capitalism, as the crossroads of socialism or barbarism, the domination of the contradiction of capital was blamed on the dialectic, and often on Marxism itself. And yet the ironies of the Hegelian cunning ruse of reason were hard to shake off entirely, leaving the lingering question of meaning at the supposed end of history. This is the most difficult aspect of Marxism, but also the most essential. It is the most esoteric, but also the substantial core of Marxism. It is the most enchanting, but also most frustrating quality of Marxism. It will inevitably return as Marxism continues to haunt the world of capitalism and its manifest contradictions. But can it be sustained? Will the capitalist world be brought back to the point of its dialectical contradiction that points beyond itself? If so, then the necessity of the Marxist negative dialectic will be felt again and anew.
Thanks, Chris. And now we'll do 3 minutes in which each panelist can respond to other panelists' remarks, and we'll just go in the same order if that's okay. Dennis, we'll start with you.
Okay, so first, one thing about Doug Lane, you said that basically the new left was better than what we have today. I think I tend to agree, and I would certainly say that the early 20th century left was certainly better than what we have today. The interesting question is why. So why is this the case? And I think it's a really wrong and idealist point of view to just say it's just the case because people now think wrong things. Like it has to be like connected to the base and to the social movements and what is happening actually in society. So yeah, I agree with you, but I think that we have to take this into account. It's really important to look at what happens on the basis. I think leftists talk too much about the left and not enough about the proletariat and the actual social movements and economic developments and stuff like this. Then one thing about Chris, I mean, it's basically very important for the platypus theory to talk about this regression or degeneration, as you called it in the beginning. And here again, the question is, where does it come from? What is the cause of this regression? And I think you would say something like the self-contradiction of bourgeois society. My problem with that is that you take basically what for Marx are economic structural problems and turn them into very lofty philosophical ones. And I think this is just not a good Marxist approach in some way. We should be talking about more precisely about the proletariat, technology, the class struggle, and these tangible material realities in society and how they develop over time. I would say that this kind of regression of consciousness, which is certainly real, goes back to some kind of impasse or stalling of the labor movement, of the class struggle. So maybe something like the revolution should have happened in Germany in 1918, 1919, and something didn't happen that should have happened, so now we are in this situation. Okay, so there is a material reason for this, and it's most clearly seen in the weakness of the labor movement today. So if we want to have the kind of more advanced consciousness again, we need to have the basically to accelerate these movements, and we have to, like Lenin said, we have to take them where they are. So we cannot just demand that they be Marxists, but we have to accept the stage of consciousness that already exists in the masses and then try to get them through the school of class struggle, which is really a school for socialism, where trade unionists are turned into Marxists. So my last point would just be that I don't think that there's a real contradiction between the workers' demand for the value of their labor power and the demand for the abolition of the capitalist system. Yeah, I mean, if you take these, there's certainly a contradiction, but as a process, there's no contradiction, because the one is just the first step and the other one is the second step, which emerges from the organic development of class struggle if just we prevent defeat. So it's basically a question of victory and defeat on every stage of this process. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much for your things all, and yeah.
Thanks, Dennis. Doug Lane. think you're muted, Doug, if you're speaking.
All right, there we go. I'll address what Dennis just said first. I don't disagree with you that you have to ask why was the new left in a better position than today's left, if you're really going to answer or justify a claim like that. And I would say that the proximity to really existing socialist parties is probably part of the reason why. The other thing you could do to try to figure out why is the new left in a better position would be to look to the Marxists who were around then and what their critiques were of capitalism, and then see what people thought and then test out whether it was true that capitalism had a different kind of character at that time. So, after World War II, most of the radical left Marxists believed that state capitalism had taken over the world and that this new form of monopoly state capitalism could manage the contradictions within society, not necessarily in a way that was going to be emancipatory. This is actually a reason to be very pessimistic about the future of humanity. So, nonetheless, though, we could say that at that time, the Fordist New Deal state capitalist system seemed to provide enough wealth for the working class for there to be the development of some ideas to transcend those conditions. Whereas today, I would say that the working class and the left is set up against itself, competing for dwindling access to, a surplus that's dwindling, or at least isn't growing at the rate that it should be. And that because that we're competing with each other for peanuts, that we're more likely to be diluted into what our real motivations are and what our politics are. So you can see that as in the recent Washington Post article about the infrastructure bill, where apparent leftists within the Biden administration are arguing that spending money on physical infrastructure is an example of nostalgia for the white working class, and hidden underneath that is a white supremacist ideology. So, so infrastructure spending to build bridges and repair the electrical grid, it needs to be supplemented with targeted spending within certain sectors of the working class and certain sectors of society. So you have to also spend on giving caregivers, specifically Black women, higher wages to do the work that they're doing, which is so vital during the pandemic. This is after a proposal to increase everyone's minimum wage to a living wage was rejected. So you have a left that can see its aims to be particular, segmented, fractured, and kind of obscure the fact that what's going on is just trying to get access to state money. Often enough for the NGOs that are proposing this, as much as or more than the working people themselves. So that would be my explanation to start anyway as to what's going on. For Chris, I would say that everything you said was very interesting. I just didn't understand enough about 1917 to 1919 and why it was ultimately that the revolutionary side of socialism that wanted to transcend labor and form a new basis for society wasn't more successful, and why the failure of that aspect of the socialist struggle led to a failure overall for even reformist social democratic movements. And I want to know more. I guess that means I should sign up for one of the platypus reading groups, but it also means I think that perhaps we all should re-examine what went down in 1919 and try to, as Dennis would say, think about how the economic conditions in the background were consequential at that time as well. So now I'll stop there.
Thanks, Doug. Doug Kellner.
Okay, I want to respond to the issues that all the speakers have brought up and what we were told to do as our mandate, which is the relevance of critical theory to contemporary politics now. And so I want to discuss that in relationship to Korsch and Marcuse. I mentioned in terms of Korsch his relevance in that he was a practical socialist. He saw Marxism as an activist theory. He thought the role of a Marxist intellectual and revolutionary was to relate theory to practice, to so constantly being struggling against capitalism, imperialism, and forced socialism. And that's what Korsch did all of his life. So he's an example of a practical socialist, a Marxist activist, as is Herbert Marcuse. Marcuse is, and unlike the other members of the Frankfurt School, Marcuse was seen as the father of the New Left, and he championed the New Left, the student movement, the Vietnam anti-war movement, and all the movements of the 60s, which makes him relevant, I think, to the Occupy movement, the Bernie Sanders movement. I was astonished when I first heard Bernie Sanders start his talks. He said, "How many of you want to have a revolution?" And everyone would cheer. "How many of you want socialism?" And all the young people would cheer. And it was astonishing to find out that 40% of the people in Iowa, of all places, identified themselves as socialist. So Marcuse was this kind of activist in the 60s and into the 70s, but Marcuse was also the first Marxist to advocate for the ecology movement. He wrote essays on ecology, and in view of the climate crisis today, Marcuse's brand of ecological socialism, again, is highly relevant to the current issues in ecology. Marcuse was also one of the first Marxists to embrace feminism. He wrote an article in the early 70s on Marxism and feminism and argued that the women's liberation movement was the most radical movement, of the time, and supported women's liberation, sexual liberation. Marcuse was notorious in his book Eros and Civilization as a sexual liberationist, so he influenced the gay and lesbian movement. And finally, Marcuse was the professor of Angela Davis, and so supported her and the Black Power movement throughout his life. And he also wrote an essay on Chicano politics, the importance of the Chicano movement as early as the 1960s. So Marcuse anticipates and is relevant to Black Lives Matter, to the Dreamers and the Latino movements of the time. So again, this to me is the model of a radical intellectual to embrace all of the movements that are the most radical and oppositional and emancipatory at the time. So that will be the end of my Marcuse relevance. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Chris?
All right, you're gonna have to forgive me, Doug Kellner. I'm gonna dispute that. I'm gonna say maybe St. Peter greeting Marcuse at the pearly gates, that these might be crimes that sins that Marcuse might have to answer for in giving solace and comfort in educating Angela Davis, for one, and also in inspiring the identity politics movement that came out of the New Left that created the framework for neoliberal capital and for woke capitalism today, and the Democratic Party and the whole business that we're now living under. And I would say that a regression. In other words, there's a reason why someone like Rosa Luxemburg polemicized against feminism. And so I think that the collapse of the Marxist critique of feminism is a real loss. Now, it might have been inevitable given the fact that there was no socialist movement. And I think that that's what really conditioned Marcuse's choice. I'd also say that there's a similarity there between Marcuse and Korsch, in that Korsch really abandoned Marxism. He adopted a very eclectic kind of pan working class perspective in which he said Bernstein, Lenin, anarchism, they all have to be considered part of the history of the workers' movement. And so he actively liquidated Marxism by the end of his life. And he was rehabilitating Bakunin against Marx. And I think that that came from the manifest failure of Marxism as a movement through some, that throws someone like Korsch and later someone like Marcuse, it throws them back, right? So, okay, we attempted to overcome capitalism and change society in a particular way. That failed. And therefore, we have to go back and reconsider all these things that Marxism had thought that it had overcome, but actually had not, right? So, of course, Marxism thought that it could lead the women's movement for equality and emancipation. It failed to do so. And that's why feminism had to arise in the New Left, because the old Marxist parties looked rather conservative, looked like they had abandoned the goal of women's equality and liberation. Similarly, Marx wrote in his program for the Workers' Party of France towards the end of his life that the struggle for socialism is to transcend all races and nationalities and to transcend the gender divide. And so the idea that you needed a Black Power movement in the 1960s, or you needed a second wave of feminism in the 60s and 70s, and that you needed a gay liberation movement, because after all, the old socialist movement, including Marxism, was for sexual emancipation, was for the decriminalization of homosexuality. August Bebel gave a 6-hour speech in the Reichstag about the history of homosexuality. Very famously, the fact that these things had to emerge as they did in the latter part of the 20th century, that's an index of the failure of socialism and the failure of Marxism. And I don't think we should accept that as progress, especially because now we have woke capitalism. Now, okay, so that takes us way off the topic of the subject, which is the politics of critical theory. However, of course, I think, that this is what critical theory has become, like through postmodernism, etc. That critical theory has become a kind of modality of discontent in capitalism that actually helps renovate capitalism, right? So, we have Robin DiAngelo, white fragility, being taught in major capitalist corporations. We have all the language of the most radical strands of PC identity politics being adopted by corporate America. And we have corporate America waiting at the ready to boycott states that pass legislation that don't toe the line of woke capitalism.
Could I?
That's a problem.
Could I respond?
Of course.
Particularly to defend Marcuse, and I'll refer to my book, Herbert, Marcuse, and the Crisis of Marxism, that I didn't get a chance to discuss. And Marcuse's whole life was dedicated to the dialectic and to reconstructing Marxism and to responding to the historical crises of the moment. So when the German Revolution failed in 1917, 1918, Marcuse wanted to reinvigorate Marxist revolutionary theory. So he wrote Reason and Revolution about Marx, Hegel, and the roots of revolution, and defended revolution and socialism his whole life. He did not really in any way advocate identity politics. He always advocated socialist politics. But Chris, as you said yourself, within the socialist movement, at different times, there were feminist groups, there were gay and lesbian groups, there were race groups, etc. And this is the way Marcuse saw New Left politics. The movement was the category we used. And it's a politics of alliance and solidarity. So it's connecting the socialist movement with the feminists, etc., gay. And I think this is what Bernie Sanders also is doing. It's sort of a Big Tent movement that is primarily socialist in its inspiration, but also it addresses race and gender and sexuality, ecology, and other issues. And that's how I see living Marxism, that it basically develops and reconstructs the Marxist theory in relationship to the social conditions, the crises of capitalism, and the political movements of the day. And that's what I learned from Marcuse, basically. So that's sort of my defense of Marcuse, but also my own position.
No, that's fair. I just think that we have to consider what's happened between then and now,
Right.
in the last 50 years. And, you know, maybe the legacy of the New Left is not simply to be affirmed at this point, given the fact that it leads us to Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Biden, Kamala Harris, etc. Right? AOC, you know, these are the new masters of capitalism.
But also the New Left leads us to the Occupy movement, to Bernie Sanders, to, you know, Black Lives Matter and all these other radical movements of the day. I mean, there's always dangers of, you know, Marxism falling into some sort of dogmatism. And there's also dangers of the splintering, you know, of the left. The left is always, we had a joke that if you had 4 Marxists in the same room in the 1960s, you'd get 5 opinions, you know, on every topic, because most of us were not dogmatic. I mean, you know, when I studied in Germany, I kept meeting Trotskyists and Maoists and, you know, CP people that really had these dogmatic ideologies of Marxism, and they could answer every question, etc. But this was a splintering of Marxism, and I see Marcuse and the New Left trying to bring all these tendencies together. So anyway, that's all.
That was the great part of your initial remarks when you pointed out that Korsch, as a student activist,
Right.
invited speakers, right, to campus as disparate as Karl Liebknecht and Eduard Bernstein,
Right.
right? In other words, members of the same party,
Right.
members of the same party.
With very opposed left.
Yeah, and by the way, that's what we need today.
I agree.
Okay.
Can I say one thing about what you two are saying, and just point something out? Marcuse turned to the feminist movement and to civil rights movements and other kinds of movements in the face of what he thought was a completely dominant monopoly capitalism that could provide through redistribution for the working class, and had pacified them. And he was wrong.
Yeah, it turned out
About
not
the
to be
nature of-
true just within a few short years.
Right. So, I mean, that has to be understood as well. You can't just affirm critical theory as it was at that time either. And stop there.
Let's move on to question and answer. And Dennis, I know you didn't get a chance to respond, but a lot of these questions are directed at you actually. So, and hopefully, you know, I'll try and squeeze some questions together for the sake of time. And Chris, Doug, and Doug as well, you can kind of jump in on some of these questions. So the first question we have directed at Dennis is, isn't the central insight of the Frankfurt School that class society posits a totality from which no class can free itself by simply following their class interests? The basic tenet of critical theory is the formation of an anti-class of emancipated individuals. What you propose seems like a revival of tried, true, and failed Marxist strategies. And I just want to add one more question, which deals with kind of failure. Dennis says that the working class movement has to reach a certain stage of development before socialism can arise. But hasn't this stage already been achieved in the 19th century? Does this past history offer anything for the present theory, positively or negatively? Can theory even recognize positive success if it involves avoiding historic defeats?
Okay, so basically to the first question, yeah, I totally, I would just say yes, and we should go back to classical Marxism. So this is like how I began my talk, that I said, okay, we have this idea in critical theory that you have this big bad totality, and then this means that even the proletariat isn't the like revolutionary class anymore. It's part of this totality, and its interests are just like inner capitalist interest, the same like the bourgeoisie. So it becomes some kind of racket or something. And this is just anti-Marxist. Like, of course, the proletariat has capitalist interests in the beginning. But the whole idea is that the dynamic of class struggle propels it on a like path towards socialism, which doesn't have to be conscious in the beginning. So the proletariat they just want, oh, I want to have more money, or fuck this kind of employer, he has been rude to us, so let's fight against them. So these are like really material and immediate interests that the workers have, and also like some just solidarity with the people with whom you are working and stuff. But this leads to a process of class struggle, which over time can accelerate in a way that basically at first you just have like some kind of trade unionism, low-key trade unionism. If you have enough success, then this can develop into mass movements, like bigger movements, which might be like, for example, radical social democrat, or like even like softcore socialist. But when they again win, and then like the party or some kind of conscious revolutionaries like guide them in this right direction, like, but not by just immediately giving them the end goal, but just like nudging them a little bit, and they have real practical success, this dynamic can radicalize, and we can have like a bigger, like real militant mass movement. But this takes time. It has to be developed. It's like a plant that has to grow. You can't just say that by spreading pure theory, we can conjure up like the revolutionary proletariat. It's a social process. It's a really complex socio-economic process. And therefore, I think, like, for example, Bernie Sanders, like a lot of leftists, they are crying that, oh no, he's not a real communist. I mean, you can't be a real communist and just talk about it all the time and then think that you could mobilize the masses. There has to be this process of gradual development. It's really important. And I think, yeah, I totally affirm this. In this sense, I think that the classical Marxist perspective is right. And with regard to the development of the development of the proletariat and of class society and stuff like this, I think the lesson is that it's not linear. So there can be defeats, and if you have a defeat of the material movement of the proletariat, then you will also have the regression of consciousness. So this is like just simply the case. So we shouldn't view it as a linear development, but it can be advanced, but it can also be retarded, and it can be like, yeah, so this is basically the thing. We shouldn't think that, oh, because we didn't have a revolution until now, this means that Marx was wrong. No, there are contingencies in history, and they are like uneven developments between, for example, the consciousness of the proletariat and the Revolutionary Party and the economic structures. Like in Russia, you had an agricultural country with no urban working class, with a majority of the population who were just simply peasants who couldn't even develop this kind of consciousness because they are not like urban proletarians. So basically, there can be like horrible things can happen in history, and it's not always Marx's fault if something goes wrong. But now we have to like try to do something and to get this like mass movement going again.
If I could just say something briefly in response to the question, which is, I tried to bring this out in my opening remarks, but maybe neglected to emphasize this point, which is that for Marx and for Marxism, the proletariat's a negative category. In other words, the proletariat is the kind of negation of bourgeois society. And so that contradiction between the proletariat as a working class, as a bourgeois urban working class, constituting the social relations of society through their labor, and there being the negation of those social relations insofar as industrial production undermines those social relations. Now, to take it one step further, that means that the task of the proletariat is to abolish itself.
Right.
Right. And so the problem being that capitalism does that already. Capitalism does abolish the proletariat already. So it's a matter of taking the negation of bourgeois society that capitalism already is and turning it into an actual emancipation, meaning people are freed from labor all the time, which means that they starve to death or become drug addicts or whatever. And so Marxism's very peculiar and different from any other form of socialist or communist thought and any other form of bourgeois, and I don't mean that negatively, any kind of radical, democratic, liberal thinking, in that it takes as its subject what is essentially a negative condition in society, namely proletarianized labor, right? So it's not like putting forward, like, in other words, the interests of the working class is to abolish itself as a working class, which is different from, like, you know, what we were talking about earlier, like feminism and Black power, etc., which would be to affirm, right? Which would be to say, you know, I'm woman, hear me roar, or, you know, Black is beautiful, right? So there are, you know, and there's a way that you could posit the interests of the working class in positive terms too, right? That what you want is for the working class to realize its rights under bourgeois social and political norms. But Marxism understands that, in fact, the fundamental condition of society is negative, and that what unites the working class, including the proletarianized working class, was always largely women and racial minorities. That needs to be remembered from the very beginning, the Industrial Revolution. It was disproportionately women and minorities, whether national minorities or racial minorities. And so I think that one bad legacy of the new left is that we have, like, the spontaneous image that we have of the working class is like straight white guys. That's not the working class. That's not the proletariat. It isn't, right? And so the question is, how do they understand their condition? How do they put forward their claims on society? How do they form their discontents? How do they posit themselves politically? Right. And so Marxism is very, very tricky in that it somehow convinced the working class in many advanced metropolitan capitalist countries to basically say capitalism is destroying us, and we are going to be the generation that sacrifices itself so that future generations don't have to be sacrificed to capital in the way that we are. And I think it's very unfortunate that, you know, you only get that around the edges now. You get a kind of, like, I don't know, Black nihilism in the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Sort of Afro-pessimism, right? The idea that, like, Black people from 1619 onwards are just chattel, right? Like this, that Black Lives Matter, which means actually this society, the United States, is defined by the negation of Black life, by anti-Blackness. Well, you know, that's a funny kind of misrecognition of something real, proletarianization. But to call proletarianization white supremacy and racism prevents the struggle for socialism from ever happening.
Sorry, I was looking for my unmute button. If there's no more responses, there's a question that, you know, might get at some of what is being raised. And it's again to Dennis, but other panelists feel free to respond. To Dennis, what is your mode of explanation of success and failures of the working class? How do you distinguish between false assessments of necessity of failures and right ones?
Okay, so I mean, yesterday when I read the this like Kinderkrankheit, so the infantile disorder text by Lenin, there he talked about like how to distinguish opportunism from like a necessary kind of tactical movement. So for example, when do you know when you're just being like childishly radical, or whether you like do the right thing? Or how do you know whether in this case doing like the kind of compromise thing, working with the reactionary trade unions or with parliamentary parties, when do you know whether it's like betraying the proletariat and just being like a shitty like Bernsteinian opportunist, and when is it like being a good Leninist and not a ultra leftist? And the answer he gives is there is no formula. Like just there is none. It's dependent on our judgment about history, about the conditions of victory and stuff like this. So it's not a question of what we would call in the abstract sense theory. It is theoretical in a wider sense, as everything is theoretical in the way that I have some conception in my mind about how the world works, but it's not something where some philosophy dude can give you the answer. It has to be, you have to look at the concrete social relations and what actually happened. And some things in history, they happen because of for example, you can point towards with the Russian Revolution, the underdevelopment of the society, which they knew, the Bolsheviks knew. Like they said, we need the revolution in Germany. If we don't have it, then basically it's for nothing. Like we need this revolution in Western Europe. So they only did it because they counted on this revolution. So why did it fail in Germany? Like I think there are many reasons, like the rise of opportunism in the SPD. We can analyze this. Why did it happen? How was it connected to like the trade union movement, the new party people who like made a career in this party? We can talk about simple tactical mistakes. So for example, when they had this Reichsräte-Kongress, so like a big congress of the councils, and they were debating 3 questions. First question, should we abolish the should we be a council republic like a Soviet republic, Räterepublik, or a parliamentary republic? The left obviously wanted the Soviet republic, and the opportunists and traitors wanted the parliamentary republic. But the Congress said, no, we want a parliamentary republic. Second question was basically, I think, I don't know the exact what was first, but one was about the army. Should we abolish the professional or like the army of Germany and make like a popular militia? And there the delegate said, yes, make the popular militia. Third question, what about the big industries? Should we put them all into the hands of the state? So should we expropriate like the big capitalists? And the Congress said yes. And then still the opposition leftists, they, instead of like participating in this government, they said, oh no, because these delegates didn't want our Soviet Republic, now we will be like making like a tantrum and just retreating. And this was a mistake. So basically you can make mistakes, tactical mistakes in this situation, and there can also be some like deeper material reasons, and it's always a combination of all of them, and there's never this simple philosophical answer to these questions.
Thanks, Dennis. Let's open it up to more general questions. So this has to do with the term materialism. The term materialism and idealism have been raised with the assumption being that Marxism is materialist. But is there not an ambiguity here? On the one hand, some Marxists have sometimes distinguished between historical materialism and dialectical materialism. Does this distinction make sense? Is Marxist materialism only a theory of society or of all of reality? Also, through Hegel, does not Marxism partake of an idealist heritage? Please clarify what you mean by materialism. I think that could be for all 4 panelists, perhaps.
I'll start it off. Marx's materialism always included consciousness and practice and the will. There was always a Hegelian moment in Marx, whether it was his dialectical theory, his emphasis on action, on individual agency, on collective agency, etc. But this issue that was raised in the question is what separated Marxists in the 1920s to the present. Certain Marxist-Leninists, and this comes out of the Soviet Russian Revolution, and Lenin believed, and Engels also believed this, that dialectical and historical materialism were 2 sides of Marxist science. The dialectical materialism was the science of nature, as Engels wrote in his book, Dialectics of Nature, whereas historical materialism was the theory of society and history, class struggle, the development of capitalism, revolution, etc. Now, the critical Marxists basically tried to overcome these dichotomies between idealism and materialism and historical and dialectical materialism. All the people that I mentioned who were critical Marxists, and that's of the 1920s, Lukács, Korsch, Gramsci, and Frankfurt School, didn't make these dualisms that the question raised. But there's a lot of Marxists that, you know, see Marxism as a science and think in these terms. So this is been a big battle throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century between orthodox Marxism that believes in these dualisms and a critical Marxism that has a more dialectical view of idealism, materialism, and historical dialectical materialism, society, history, and nature that sees them as a sort of dialectical totality. So that's my quick answer.
Okay, so yeah, I think, I mean, let's forget like this idea of dialectical materialism, because I think historical materialism, it's really clearly defined, and you can find it everywhere in Marx's work, especially like when he attacks the young Hegelians, but also in Capital and stuff. And it's basically like, it's not something fancy, it's something really easy, that you have this kind of like primary system, which is the economy, which consists of like two parts mainly: the relations of production, Produktionsverhältnisse, which is like basically who owns like the means of production, how is this like the for example feudalism, then you have in feudalism you have the peasants who work the fields and the lord extracts from them like basically their pure labor and the stuff they produce. And under capitalism you have the wage laborer who is free in a double way, so she can like sell her labor power, but she has no means of production on her own. Others own the means of production, so all of this kind of stuff. And then you have the productive forces, which are basically the technology and also like the management techniques and all of the techniques that are used to basically produce things. And Marx says that the primary mover is the productive forces, and then they create certain like relations of production, whereas I think like in some sense they influence each other, but I still would say that there's a primary influence from the productive forces. And then basically when they come into conflict with each other, this can create like a revolution. This can create some kind of, let's say contradictions or problems in societies. And also part of this historical materialism is to say that ideas of the time, so what people think actually on a large scale, is dependent on these material relations. And of course, class struggle is part of this is part of these relations. So the relations of production, the Produktionsverhältnisse, they incorporate the relationship between the classes. So this means that if we say that consciousness derives from this economic base, then it means that if something changes in the relationship between the classes, which could mean that, for example, we have more unionization, more like activity of the working class to organize itself, this will also create a different consciousness. So that, I think there has been this move later in Marxism, and I think like what Doug Kellner said, I agree with you, but I think it's a bad thing. I think there has been this move in Marxism to like obfuscate this primacy of the economy and say, no, it's just the totality and they just all influence each other and stuff. And I think, no, let's go back to like a more substantial materialist view of history. Of course, it's not 100% true. Of course, ideas have some impact on society, but we have to like go back to this primacy of the material base. And I think that has been forgotten in some sense, even like in today's Marxist left.
Right.
If I could say briefly something. Oh, sorry, Doug, maybe you could respond. Go ahead, Doug.
Doug Kellner, right?
Yes.
Oh,
I didn't want to.
I just wanted to say one word. We also shouldn't forget nature, that this is part, of our concrete reality. I mentioned the ecology issue, but for Marx too, I mean, there's human nature, there's the senses, there's, the emancipation of the full human being, etc. So Marxism, is this dialectical theory that brings together society and nature and history. But I agree that the historical materialism is probably the key idea of Marxism, and the issue of the primacy of the economy under capitalism and class struggle. Those are probably the basic ideas of Marxism. They're still relevant today and have been from the beginning. So that's it.
I would just say something in defense of dialectical materialism, which is to say that nature is, as I pointed out in my opening remarks, nature is a social relation, right? Or as Emile Durkheim says, it's not that society takes place in nature, but rather nature takes place in society, meaning nature is how we relate to it. And really, we have to think about our changing relations to nature. I do think that bourgeois society and therefore capitalism is cosmological in character. In other words, I think that the fact that society has become economic is actually a function of the crisis of capitalism. I don't think that feudalism was an economic system. I don't think, the Asiatic mode of production, I don't think that these things were economic systems. I think they were cosmologies. And I think that it's capitalism that economizes society, that makes social relations economic, that makes nature an object of economic calculation, and that makes even labor a quantifiable economic fact. And so I think that, the danger of saying, let's get to the economic base of things as the material substance of things, is that the economy is itself a phenomenon. And I would say the fact that society has become economic is a phenomenon of the crisis of capitalism. Because bourgeois society was not meant to be economic. In other words, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, liberty, equality, fraternity, the humanism of the Renaissance, or even with the work ethic, the Protestant theology of the Reformation, none of these intend to produce an economic society. Right. And so I think that we should not sort of naturalize that. Now, because Marx, I think he did define human nature and capitalism as homo faber and homo economicus, as this kind of new human nature, but in an ironical way. And actually, he had a critical perspective on the fact that the workers were presenting economic demands. He criticized both the political demands of the workers for citizenship and suffrage and the right to vote and this kind of thing. But he also criticized the economic demands as such, right? And I think that that's important, because otherwise what we end up doing is falling into the very antinomies that capitalism itself generates. For instance, the antinomy between economics and politics, right? Or between labor and capital, or a bunch of different things, or between humanity and nature, right? As if we're not nature. Of course, we are nature. We're part of nature. It's not like nature's out there, right? And so again, nature is what we are in relation to it, including ourselves. And it's just very tricky to say, the old socialist movement was very economic in its motivation. It was very much based on things like economic crises and the cycle, the boom bust cycle of capital, crises of value that manifested as economic crises. But I think Marxism always had a larger context and critical frame with which to see that. And I think it's so again, it's kind of like historical materialism. Would that be like an economic theory of history? And then dialectics of nature would be some kind of transhistorical philosophy of nature? I don't think so. I don't think Engels meant it that way. So I also, I kind of detect a little bit of we want Marx, not Engels. No, Engels was pretty good on this stuff, actually, if you actually read it. in terms of understanding emancipation as an emancipated new relationship to nature, right? Not just an economic change.
I want to take a question from the floor real quick. Ephraim, did you want to ask your question?
Doug Lane might want to say something.
I just want to ask a question to throw it into the mix too. So, but you can take this other question first. But when we get a chance, I'd like to hear what everyone thinks as far as why Corbyn and Sanders both lost. Like, why are we in this moment where what we invested in, what Dennis suggests, I think, that we continue to invest in, lost. So that's all I want to throw out there.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah, I guess you can. Yeah, Doug, everyone should address that question, especially seeing as that seems to be where I think, Dennis should respond to your point there, that he's continuing that politics. But Doug, I want to address you directly first, Doug Lane, because, you quibbled with the panel description that there wasn't a kind of, you disputed that there's a kind of return to an interesting critical theory in the aftermath of an attempt to explain why Corbyn and Sanders failed. But I think you should take a bit of responsibility there or recognize yourself. It's you with your, YouTube channel, educating 20-somethings in what you're describing as critical theory. So maybe you don't need to go to a platypus reading group, maybe you do, but you should take ownership over the fact that you are educating people in this. You're making certain specific claims in recent videos, for example, about Lukács or about Grossman over Adorno and Horkheimer. And you should kind of be less bashful about that and basically take responsibility for it. What does it mean? Right. My question.
I go into a room and I say, how many people are in this room? And I count 4 because I don't count myself. Right. Is that kind of that's the.
You got to drop that.
Okay.
Immediately. My question is on a podcast, millennial leftist type of stuff, Alfie Bunga Bunga. I recently heard an episode where they had Amber Frost from Chapo Trap House and Jacobin talking about the January 6th protests. And she said, oh, well, I've been reading a lot of Adorno lately. And I can't help but read Adorno into everything. And she was kind of talking about a psychology of mass society and authoritarianism and all that stuff. And the hosts responded by saying, you should be careful. That's very dangerous. And so my question is, what is dangerous?
Reading Adorno is dangerous.
Reading Adorno is dangerous. So my question is, what is dangerous about Adorno? What did they mean by that? And I would like all the panelists to respond, and I'd like to specify slightly further. It has something to do with what the other Doug, Kellner, was bringing up about the Marcuse-Adorno dispute in the New Left, about whether practice was blocked in the present and what that means for Marxism. And that also goes to the point Dennis Kramer opened up with, which is the separation of theory and praxis and what that means. So the question is, why is Adorno dangerous? And what does it have to do with the question of whether praxis is not immediately available to us in the present?
So who should go first? Should I go first since that was originally? Okay. So what I would say is that you're right. I am bringing critical theory to this moment, but I would just say that I've been interested in and focused on something that I called critical theory for longer than this moment. And really, if you wanted to know when I returned to critical theory as a primary focus in my own thinking, that is the kind of critical theory where you're trying to understand how the economy and capitalism is developing as it influences ideology and politics. That goes back to when Trump was elected, and not the failure of Sanders and Corbyn, because and that also goes back to a moment where the organization I was a part of went into crisis. And I think they went into crisis because they didn't have a politics. They had a critique, a really solid critique of capitalism and a theory, and it's called TSSI. And they had a critique of the very social democratic types that dominated the Sanders movement. They had a critique of the redistributivist approach, the underconsumptionist approach to understanding capital, all sorts of things like that. But they didn't have a politics. And so I kind of returned to critical theory to see what was trying to go, like what was going on, that Marxism didn't have a politics. And so, so I'll say that. And then the question of what's dangerous about Adorno, it really depends on who you're asking. Why did the Alpha Bunga Bunga gang say that? I mean, I'm publishing one of their books soon, the end of history. My guess is that Adorno and critical theory amongst people who are trying to be Marxist today is blamed for a shift from working class politics and struggle, whether that's defined as social democratic working class politics, which I think it often is, by dirtbags, people at Chapo and maybe Alpha Bunga Bunga, or something more radical. It is a question I couldn't answer, but it's blamed for a shift away from the working class towards woke politics, towards a postmodern kind of approach to politics. And you could probably turn to one of my videos critiquing Adorno or Marcuse or Friedrich Pollock, probably most especially, and kind of level that kind of charge against the critical theorists and against the Frankfurt School. But I would just say that I'm not sure I'm right, and certainly it's a bad idea to ever say that reading the history of the Marxist struggle and socialist struggle is dangerous. It's only dangerous if you're dogmatic in the way you approach understanding socialism, and I think that what it speaks to is the way that the left is always immediate in its responses to things. I used to be a Bernie Sanders supporter, but now I'm a Maoist, and I'm full on a Maoist, and I'm going to go on Twitter and represent Mao's thought after having read, maybe a pamphlet, or now I'm online. I'm with Adorno now, and so it's just a big. We approach left politics, especially online, especially around these media entities, which have their own material basis, and which is an unhealthy one, as like a bunch of different fan clubs. And which club are you going to be in is kind of the question. If you're on Team Adorno, then that puts you probably eventually with Kamala Harris or something like that, so that would be my answers.
Via Judith Butler, right?
Yeah, right.
Via Judith Butler. I mean, I would say, right, I would agree with Doug that what makes Adorno dangerous is that he's dangerous to dogmatism. And so if one has a dogmatic perspective, then Adorno is going to threaten to demoralize you or to somehow undermine you in some way. I think the salience and currency of Adorno since Trump's election is rather unfortunate. As if we need a critique of the authoritarian personality to explain Trump, but somehow we didn't need a critique of the authoritarian personality to explain Obama or Hillary Clinton or whomever, right? I think that's really unfortunate, that it becomes the Frankfurt School as like the critics of fascism, right? Whereas the entire point of the Frankfurt School was that they didn't really care about the fringe fascist groups in post-war Bundesrepublik Germany. They cared about fascism in liberal democracy, right? Like the inherent fascism within liberal democracy. And by the way, that's a long-standing issue. That's not an issue that just starts in 1933 or even starts in 1919 with the Freikorps, etc. It's more of a long-standing issue in terms of the capitalist state and mass politics, and socialism. The struggle for socialism is bound up in that. The struggle for socialism is really I was just teaching Adorno last week to my Art Institute students, and he said, look, can you distinguish between the communist activists and the fascists? Not really. You can't, right? Unless you look at, I think he says Marx's definition of the proletariat, which remains unshaken in its essence, even if it has nothing to do with people's consciousness, right? So it's just a funny thing that we're living through. I don't know when Judith Butler discovered Adorno, but it was a bad thing. She would have been better off staying a Foucauldian. That's more true. And right, and so she might have put in the memo to her check to the Kamala Harris campaign, love Adorno, possibly. I don't know, but but this question of critical theory as an explanation for, so Doug, I'll answer you and then cede it to the others. What does critical theory have to say about the failure of the Sanders and the Corbyn campaign? Not much. Like, in other words, you don't need a laser drill, right, to poke a hole in caulkboard, right? Like, in other words, I don't think that Sanders and Corbyn's failure demands a very sophisticated explanation. I think that they offered, both of whom came to their political careers as capitalist politicians in the Labor Party and as an independent in the case of Sanders in the United States, in the 1980s against Thatcher and Reagan as anti-neoliberal politicians. And so the crisis of neoliberalism in the Great Recession allowed them to rise to the occasion and say, we've been saying this all along about this neoliberalism. And they offered to go back to a kind of pre-neoliberalism. And that's just not going to happen. That's just not going to happen. I don't know if you need like sophisticated theory to explain why we're not going to go back to pre-neoliberalism. We're not going to go back to the old labor or Great Society Democratic Party. We're not. Like, the world experienced a crisis in the 70s that you pointed out, Doug, right? That the assumption that post-World War II prosperity was never ending proved to be an illusion. It should always have been seen as an illusion, but proved to be an illusion in the 1970s, and you can't go back. Like, neoliberalism was the necessary new form of capitalism. We're not going to go back to pre-neoliberalism. I think the millennials as a boom generation, as a bunch of college-educated kids who were shocked to not find work after graduation, I think they embraced socialism as some kind of, why isn't there a GI Bill for me? Right? Why isn't there a great society for me? Why aren't there corporate jobs for me? Right? And they wanted Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders to give them that. That's just not in the cards. That's just not possible. Right? I don't know. Do you need Adorno for that, or Pollock or Grossman? No, you don't. I don't think you need that kind of sophisticated critical theory to explain why we're not going to go back to the Great Society and old labor and that world. I don't know.
I think you do if you think the reason why is because we're not going to have the prosperity that came after World War II. If you recognize that the prosperity disappeared for not just social, political reasons, but also for economic reasons, then you do need to at least understand what the thinking was around the Great Society on the left, and then ask yourself, like, what kinds of things might, theoretically, like as a science fiction writer would, what kinds of things would have to happen to get that back? And would they be at all acceptable? I mean, they wouldn't be, right? I mean, the kind of collapse that you'd have to suffer and how much damage the world would have to take in order to get that kind of prosperity back, and from my perspective, is obviously unacceptable. So when people are offering to go back, they're offering to go back to a horror show, and that needs to be understood. And I don't think that's obvious to everybody.
Early on, Jacobin published an essay by Peter Fraze called Four Possible Futures that I always like to make reference to. And he talks about like the different configurations of capitalism that might happen. And one of which, you know, and also post-capitalism that might happen. One of which is communism, but he doesn't think that's very likely. You know, but rentism, like he's got these different categories, and also socialism as a kind of social democracy. You know, it's pretty sober look. It's from like the Occupy Wall Street moment. It's from like 2010, 2011. So it's in the height of the Great Recession. And it's not particularly Marxist. It isn't, right? It's just purely descriptive. It's just saying, okay, what are the tendencies of capitalism? What are the possible options that capitalism can take, given, you know, the way it exists now and the crisis that it's in? Like, how can it save itself? It can save itself in these various ways. And I think that they would have been better off to take that more seriously. In other words, that was like an attempt, you know, a theoretical attempt to like prognose the future of capitalism that then they just abandoned in favor of, well, Bernie's going to give us Medicare for all. You know, I mean, it's like,
but
go ahead.
There's a problem with this explanation. I mean, let's assume, okay, it's true. Like the program of Bernie Sanders wouldn't be a solution. Like I also think it's not a long-term solution for the problems we're facing. But I mean, basically, this kind of explanation would perfectly work in a like imagined universe where Bernie Sanders won the presidential election and then he couldn't like really deliver. So then you could say, okay, yeah, the reason why he failed was because the program he had was not like adequate. It was just like a going back to the Fordist Keynesian like welfare state, and this was not sustainable, so he had to fail, like some kind of Syriza like situation, but just without the German pressure, just like it didn't work out. So then we would be totally on board with this analysis. But what happened is that he lost like basically the primaries. So
yeah, what you're neglecting is that there's no way he would have gotten a nomination ever. Like the Democratic Party, that would never have happened. And
yeah, exactly. But this is something else. Like he failed in the sense that the Democratic Party didn't let him win. But I think like the question is, did he really fail? What do we mean with fail? From which perspective? From his perspective, yes, he did fail. But I think he didn't fail from our perspective, because this was an important thing to like strengthen the left in America. And now I agree, like the US left is still seriously really shitty, and like there's all of this wokeness bullshit and all of this like stuff, and I wouldn't say that they are really socialists, but it doesn't matter. Like the left today in America is totally like more advanced than it was before the Sanders campaign. This is what matters from the materialist perspective.
Dennis, I thought that you were interested in the working class, meaning what you have to say is what did Bernie Sanders do for the workers? Because as soon as these DSA kids and, you know, these middle class kids, DSAers, as soon as they get jobs, whether as Democratic Party operatives or in corporate America, their socialism is going to be forgotten like tomorrow, right? So the working
but most of them are workers. Like most of them are wage laborers. Like most of them will not be basically owners of the means of production.
No, I understand
they are workers,
that, but they're not. Yeah. You know what I mean, right? Like yes, they're employees. They're paid a wage, right? Often they're also paid stock options, you know, like Google type people, right? They're you know, there's all of that. I'm just saying, like the working class, the proletarianized working class. People who voted for Trump. Let's get real.
But this is a mistake. This is a mistake that we think that we still have this view that, for example, someone with a college education cannot belong to the working class.
No,
like
they can.
Working class in Marxist terms.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying if it's only that, if it's only college educated people, that's not really representative.
No, yeah, it's not.
Can I jump in? We have to think of Corbyn.
One sentence.
Too.
It's a gradual development.
Corbyn
like
lost the working class too.
Wait.
Corbyn lost the workers over Brexit.
And he didn't get blocked by the Labour Party. He was defeated by the loss of the voters, and so, you know, whether the Democratic Party ultimately couldn't stop working class people from going and voting in the primaries. I mean, so if Sanders had enough working class support, he would have won the primaries. Whether he could have gotten anything accomplished once he was elected is a different question. But he lost because the political forces in society weren't aligned around him. to give him even the primary. And I also don't think he lost from his perspective. I think his perspective and yours are the same. That he didn't win. He didn't run to win the nomination. Or the presidency. He ran.
He ran to introduce into the conversation
symbolic socialism into
and I think that's a problem.
I think that's great. Am I muted here?
No, go ahead.
No, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, I want to take the position that Sanders won because he put socialism on the agenda, but also he addressed the working class and working class issues as part of a key part of his agenda. Bernie Sanders is an old-fashioned social democrat. It's health, it's welfare, it's workers' rights, it's the labor movement, etc. So he actually put on the agenda working class issues that hadn't been put on previously, as well as making socialism viable. And it remains to be seen to what extent Sanders and others of the left will be able to influence Biden. But they're certainly going to contest any neoliberal regression on behalf of Biden and the Democrats. And I think they're pushing them, that the party is further to the left than it's been any time in my lifetime. And I think it's because of Bernie Sanders and to some extent Elizabeth Warren and other progressive candidates that
though, let me just say, I'm just thinking, I'm from a working class background. My family's working class. They voted for Obama, they voted for Trump. They hear Bernie Sanders say that Trump is the most sexist, homophobic, racist president ever. And that's a done deal for them. In other words, they don't believe that. And while my family is white, I also imagine that a lot of people of color who voted for Trump, who are working class people, also don't buy it. They don't buy the Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, like woke capitalism, because there is a woke capitalism afoot, right? And progressive capitalism being called socialism is a major ideological defeat for any kind of notion of socialism, because working class people will think socialism means woke capitalism. They'll think that socialism means social justice, equity, capitalism. That's to their disadvantage. That doesn't speak to them as people who are not educated and acculturated into PC politics.
Okay.
Can
I say one thing?
Alienates the working class.
Sometimes you just say that basically the working class is not a sociological category, it's a political and historical category. I would say no, both is wrong. The working class is an economic category. So, and now I think you're regressing to a very much sociological view of what the working class is. That you say, for example, that because they are not educated. No, this is not the working class. The working class are those who don't have the means of production, who have to sell their labor power to the capitalists in order to survive. And this basically, these college kids that you talk about, or like the urban working class and stuff, they are workers. Like they have to sell their labor power. They are a segment of the working class. And I think that by mobilizing these people, even though they have a wrong consciousness, but simply by mobilizing these people, there is the opportunity for the left to channel this energy maybe into the trade unions and look at, for example, Amazon, something like this, organize some strikes there, take these people and the most advanced like elements of them and say, come on, fuck this wokeness bullshit, learn how to do organizing, go into the Amazon warehouses, or even people who are already working there. Like I think there are some Sanders supporters in there, and start to organize the workers. And from there on, we can like go on and basically build the movement. And I think this Sanders has given us the tools necessary that we can now use to advance this thing. We don't have to stand at the sidelines and just say, oh fuck, they don't read Rosa Luxemburg all the time.
No,
they don't want to.
Can I jump in and say, I want to say something about this Washington Post article about the White House is going to not spend as much on infrastructure directly, but also funnel it into giving money to care workers. Yeah, and equity. And so like, okay, so what is that? that is representing in some ways working class interests, their economic interests, right? The economic interests of the care workers, which are real, are being represented by the Democratic Party in a fractured way, in a way to divide the working class.
To divide the working class, that's right. And that's the real meaning of it.
So we are going to fund, and it probably won't be very effective either.
No,
And
it's going to be a pittance. It's going to be a pittance. It's a pure gesture.
Yeah. So they're racializing the way that they are distributing the funds of the state, which are stepping in between capitalism and the wage. So there's no longer a direct, you can't just say, okay, well, a struggle for wages is going to be, the way in which the working class directly expresses its economic interests, which will then lead to a revolutionary struggle, because there's this mediating institution,
The Democratic Party.
The Democratic Party,
Which is real. It's the most powerful party in the world. It's the majority party in the United States, and the United States is still the dominant world power. The Democratic Party is the most powerful party in world history ever.
I think we have to be dialectical. Now. Republican Party exists as well, right? I mean, it also
the Republican Party is always the clown car.
I want to jump in. I think we should shift the discussion from the present for the sake of diversity of answering questions. And we're going to I have about 20 minutes. I'm going to get to audience questions, but there's two kind of basic questions in the chat that I think could be good to address. One is, what is the continuity between Marx and the Frankfurt School? That seems to be at issue. And Dennis, maybe you could speak to what you perceive as their discontinuity. And then one more, which is, what is the difference politically between a Marxist critical theory and a postmodern critical theory? How did this distinction occur and reflect wider changes in the left and from the New Left movement to the 80s and 90s?
Wait, who was that aimed at?
I think everyone.
Okay.
I mean, perhaps, Dennis, you could prod by making a case for the discontinuity between Marx and Frankfurt.
Yeah, so first, I don't say, I would also say there's a continuity, obviously. I mean, the critical theory was heavily influenced by Marxism. I think I see the strongest continuity actually with Marcuse, because he also took this idea of the revolutionary subject. I don't agree with him that he said, okay, now we have this peace that has been imposed by the welfare state, so we have to find some Randgruppen, groups on the periphery, which I think later in Maoism and stuff, it may be some precursor of identity politics. But I agree with his basic insight, the basic idea to stick to the revolutionary subject, which is faithful to Marxism. Whereas in Adorno and Horkheimer, you have the idea that the revolutionary subject is simply gone. And therefore we just do the I don't know the English term. They called it also Flaschenpost. So when you put some kind of paper in a bottle. Yeah, exactly. A message in a bottle and just throw it somewhere for someone else to read later. But obviously there are continuities, and the Frankfurt School is like a Marxist school. But I think the discontinuity is simply that the historical materialism and the notion of class struggle, that these issues have been put to the sidelines. So there is I think even maybe we should just stop pretending that there's this one real Marxism and everyone just tries to steal some quotes and say that their own position is the only real Marxist position. Maybe Marxism from the beginning was had some internal you can have different accents. You can say this part of Marxism is really important to me and I want to accentuate it, and therefore you have to do some injustice to another part and stuff like this. It's basically a question of truth, and we have to find out with regard to history and our praxis and everything what's really true. So I wouldn't say that they are not Marxist. They are certainly Marxist, but I believe that historical materialism and class struggle are really important parts of Marxism. And I think especially in Horkheimer and Adorno, they don't get enough attention. So this would be my position, but I would never say that they are not Marxists. It was a little bit polemical that I did it in the beginning.
Could I specify what it means to say that the revolutionary subject no longer exists? They didn't mean the working class. They meant the party. That's very important, because of course they thought the working class and proletarianized labor and the proletariat as the negation of bourgeois society, that still existed. But that's not the revolutionary subject. The revolutionary subject is the party, and the party didn't exist anymore. Now, it's interesting, in their own time, of course, the party did exist, and it was this major oppressive force. It was Stalinist parties. It was the Stalinist party, which became fragmented between Moscow and Peking, or Maoism, and old line Stalinism and Brezhnevism, etc. But we have to be very specific about what they meant by that. So the revolutionary subject didn't exist. That didn't mean that the problem of capitalism didn't exist in a historical, materialist, or economic sense. It meant there was no political subject of revolution, because revolution's political proposition. And they didn't think that that was necessarily forever, but it was true in their own time. In other words, they acknowledged the profound defeat of fascism and Stalinism, right? The 30s were a profound defeat for the working class's struggle for socialism. And it took decades to overcome that. And the New Left tried to lift its head out of the rubble, right? And tried to grope its way back, but ultimately didn't, because it didn't want the party, right? And so, yeah, I mean, it's not about just the workers and they have to struggle and, and first we need the class struggle and then we can have socialism. And then we can have theory, but don't impose the theory on the workers because it's unmotivated. That's all true. But the question is, between here and there, like here in socialism, there's going to have to be the party.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. But then the task is to build it. And basically, I think what I would say to Adorno and Horkheimer is, okay, if this party doesn't exist, then let's build it. Yeah, exactly.
How do you build it? Well, in their time, we should not underestimate just the repressive power of the SPD. You read, I helped discover this text that was published, the 1956 Discussion of Theory and Practice, published in English as Towards a New Manifesto by Adorno and Horkheimer. And they just say, we should rewrite the Communist Manifesto. And they're like, wait, but there's no audience for it. Like, it can't be distributed in the Soviet Union. Americans wouldn't be interested. And in Britain, it would just immediately lead to the Labour Party. In Germany, it would just immediately lead to the SPD. Maybe in France or Italy, because these communist parties, maybe somebody could understand what we're talking about, maybe. But, there was the party, but it wasn't a revolutionary subject. It was a counter-revolutionary subject, and it was powerful. And it really stopped a lot. Like, the communist parties, the social democratic parties, the Labour Party in the UK stopped a lot. Now, the Democrats weren't as much of an obstacle, right? That's why you could have the New Left. That's why you could have the New Left coming out of the free speech movement and the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement. The Democrats were an obstacle. They were much more of an obstacle then than they are now, by the way. They were much more organized, thoroughly organized, and controlled people a lot more then than they do now. The control is softer and more elusive now and over a narrower portion of the population, right? But, again, I kind of forgive Horkheimer and Adorno because, look, they're right there. They're dealing with the Socialist Unity Party in East Germany, and they're dealing with the SPD, and they're dealing with the Soviet Union exists, and and the Labour Party, and these are formidable obstacles in their time to the emergence of a real socialist party, because that's what they say. They say, look, we're talking about reestablishing the Socialist Party. And the problem is that immediately everything gets shunted into these other things that kills it. And that's happening in our time now. It's been happening. It continues. That's real.
I just want to get as many questions as possible. So Doug, if either of you had a response, or I'm going to then take a question from the audience, but I wanted to give you a chance.
Let me just say a quick word about critical theory and postmodern theory. By the way, I agree completely with Dennis on the continuity and discontinuity between Frankfurt School and classical Marxism. But I would also argue that with postmodern theory and critical theory, there's continuities and discontinuities, and Habermas has made a dichotomy between them. And I've had face-to-face arguments with Habermas on this issue. Habermas basically says postmodernists are irrationalists. They want to throw out the Enlightenment, and we need to defend the Enlightenment as good social democrats, as good, people, etc. And that's just an oversimplification. It's very complex, the relation between Marxism, critical theory, and postmodernism. All the postmodern theorists, Baudrillard, Lyotard, Deleuze, Guattari, they had Marxist moments. There's many overlappings with critical theory, and there's big differences. So this requires a very complex dialectical discussion to answer this whole issue of postmodern theory. But I just wanted to throw that out to answer the audience.
Which is why after the revolution, the followers of Baudrillard and Lyotard and those people will probably do well in a re-education camp. They have their moments. All right.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from the floor. Pam, if you wanted to speak. See if Mike can let you. There we go.
Yes, hello. This was brought up a bit earlier, so hope that we can just go back. I just wanted to point out that there is a philosophy of history here that Dennis is operating with, and I wanted us to reflect on it. So earlier, when we talked about this problem of regression, or what Dennis, you've addressed as a kind of retardation of the movement. In Platypus, we contend with this, we face this as this conflict that comes from the left itself. So in Chris's presentation, he pointed out that sometimes the strength of the socialists lead to their demise, right? So the social democratic parties become the last bulwark of capitalism. And this problem is something that we have to contend with. But it seems like in your presentation and your response, you see these problems as contingencies, as problems of contingencies, problems of external factors, of material factors. And so I wanted you to reflect, and maybe others can talk about this, how we understand the history of the left and the history of defeat, not simply as a kind of accumulation of material problems. And if it's not that, how should we think about this?
Okay, it's a very nice question. So I will be brief. So I think there are multiple different factors involved. Like some of them are really like these hardcore material things. If you look at, like, for example, okay, what's the situation of the economy? Is there a crisis or not? And how strong is the bargaining position of the proletariat with regard to the bourgeoisie? And these things massively influence the outcome of struggles. Then there's just tactical mistakes that the actors make, like basically that you do a compromise at the wrong time or something like this, some kind of tactical mistake, contingency, stuff like this. But there's also some way, I think, where the left impedes itself, and it has to do with the inertia of organizations. So basically, if you have this kind of class struggle which accelerates over time, then in all of the stages of development, organizations will form, which are adequate to the current state of class consciousness in the proletariat and the current stage of the development of the proletarian class struggle. But when, because of this positive feedback loop that Rosa Luxemburg describes, when the proletariat gains a new stage of consciousness, then the old organizations will create an obstacle to the new kind of consciousness that the proletariat has. So they will try to keep them down, because organizations are more passive than the spontaneous masses. And this is somewhere where, for example, the party or some kind of more conscious revolutionaries are necessary to anticipate this and to basically create some countermeasures, which we have to develop. I have some ideas how to do it, but I think it's like a complicated issue and I can't deal with it now. But I think like this certainly does exist, but we also shouldn't discount the other factors. Like history is not this simple philosophical game. It's like a very complex interplay of material reasons, of tactical mistakes, just contingencies and randomness, and also these inherent kind of contradictions where the success of the left creates obstacles to its further development. So all of these things have to be like combined in our view, and we shouldn't just say that there's just like one cause why there's sometimes like a stoppage of the development of proletarian movements.
Okay, we're getting close to our time. I'm going to take one more question from the floor because I think a lot of the questions in the chat have repeated themselves. And then perhaps you guys can also offer your closing remarks with this question. Spencer, would you like to ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about this term critical theory. The question's already been raised, but perhaps simply to revisit it or to put a finer point on it. The question, is critical theory a kind of code for Marxism? It is a shorthand that is useful to a degree, but it is also misleading in that obviously the Frankfurt School is a very different thing than the socialist intellectualism of the 19th century before the Second International, or the kind of party intellectuals of the Second International. And so there's a question of, first of all, was critical theory in the sense of the Frankfurt School, and I mean in terms of their stance, their distance from politics, their abstention from party politics. And I think Douglas Kellner brought up the way that, for instance, Korsch and others of that generation, trace a kind of parallel development in that they were intellectuals within social democracy, broadly speaking, of course, in his case, in the USPD and the KPD, but eventually ends up a kind of intellectual unaffiliated, or in the Frankfurt School, a kind of a loose affiliation of intellectuals with a common inspiration, versus the aftermath of critical theory, because we can't really say that there's been, there's the idea of a second generation and a third generation of critical theory, but again, that masks the discontinuities. And there, I guess I would ask Doug Kellner to reflect on, a generation that sort of wrote books about critical theory, but wasn't in direct continuity. And finally, what does it mean to inherit that tradition today? And obviously, platypus is one kind of response to that problem. And we don't do Frankfurt School type critical theorizing exactly. And Doug, I think you've also thought about this. What does it mean to inherit this tradition today? And I suppose for Dennis, I guess the question is, apart from your dissatisfaction with young intellectuals who want to write books and talk on podcasts and aren't doing something more tangible politically, how do you understand that the historical phenomenon of a generation of young people who are sort of sorting through, sifting through these ideas in pretty distantly related to anything in the political world. In that sense, caught in a similar but distinct circumstance or predicament to that of that we designate by the term critical theory. That's all.
Let me start off on that by taking up the issue of the party. And it occurred to me that one of the biggest divisions within the critical Marxist tradition that I talked about, Lukács, Korsch, Gramsci, Marcuse, Frankfurt School, was the party. That Lukács and Korsch and Gramsci all were basically party activists, although at different times they got kicked out of, this party or the other party. Particularly Korsch was continually changing parties, whereas the Frankfurt School were always independent intellectuals. Actually, this brings us also to the present and the Bernie Sanders issue and socialist politics today. The left has not had a radical party or a democratic socialist party that would be consistent with the emancipatory theory of critical theory since maybe the Debs Socialist Party at the early 20th century. That the Socialist Party afterwards has become just Social Democrat, and now, and I think Chris said this, a wing of the Democratic Party, etc. So today, young people don't really have a revolutionary party they can go to. So then it's a question of groups that you find or movements. So Bernie Sanders, I think, tried to create a revolutionary movement. And in that sense, he won, in that he did create a movement for socialism that had some impact, etc. But what do you do now? What's the next step? And again, I'm going to leave it to the youth to decide, what movements they're going to create. And it's the young have always, in my lifetime, created their own movements. I was part of the creation of the new left. There were anti-feminists, civil rights, ecology movement, Occupy movement, Sanders movements, that young people and progressives basically have the challenge, and radical intellectuals have the challenge of deciding what movements are the most progressive or the ones that you can affiliate with. And this is probably a failure of the Frankfurt School, was, with the exception of Marcuse, to affiliate themselves with radical political movements. They tended to be too distanced from the politics and struggles of the day. And Marxism says, and Korsch says, you got to get involved, that this is what it means to be a Marxist or radical intellectual. So I'll stop at that.
Yeah, totally. Like this will be my last comment, just this. I think all of my thinking is inherently linked to our relatively small organization of ADH. Of course, we try to grow, but I think everything's linked with this organization, and I'm thinking within that structure. And it's people who do media work with us, people who do design, people who do trade union organizing, and only in this kind of framework, people who program the internal communication structures and stuff. Only within this framework, I think I can think about theoretical issues. I would have a totally different perspective on these things if I would just sit there and read books. So I don't hate people who sit there and read books and try to write books. I'm one of these people, but I think if you really want to think about those things, then maybe get involved with a movement, with an organization, with a group, and work in a cooperative way. I think the people I have my problems with Lukács's work, but I think he is still like much more of a real revolutionary than like the Adorno and Horkheimer could ever be, because he was involved, like he fought in the front lines, he was involved in the struggle, and this has such a big impact on your consciousness that I think you can't emphasize enough. And I want to thank everyone, and also the Platist Affiliated Society, for inviting me here. Thank you all for your nice questions, and all of the other panelists for their input.
Doug and Chris, did you have anything to add or anything you'd like to say as closing remarks?
I have something that came to mind. One of the questioners, when one of the questioners put to me, you know, that I was being too bashful and I wasn't counting myself in terms of the impact that I might be having on bringing critical theory back after the failure of the Sanders campaign, say. That actually really hit home, and it hit home also as a critique of what Kellner just said about the young people and leaving it to them to be the creative force that will to start new movements and bring the left forward and bring socialism either into existence or further down the road. Because I just think of my own kids, and specifically of one of the organizations that is emerging now because of my own kid, Ben Lane, who's started a group called the Pacific Northwest Communists. And I went to a park to witness the opening of the Portland branch of the Pacific Northwest Communists. His first one was in Eugene. And what did I find? I found a bunch of 20-something-year-old men who were organizing around a project to do what? Publish zines. It was like I had returned to the 90s, paper zines. This was something I could have done, and probably in a way did when I was their age, and there was definitely a sense of repetition. And so, you know, the youth are going to pick up what we leave behind and try to create movements based on what they can interpret of what we've done. It's so if we, you know, just because I'm 50 doesn't mean I don't have any responsibility for the future anymore. And I should probably take responsibility for the young too, and try to step in and say, hey, you know what, I've been here before. Here's some of the dangers from that approach. And, you know, you should think about these kinds of things without being, you know, without the expectation that they're just gonna, because I'm dad, do exactly as I say. But but yeah, I mean, we can't. I think this is one of the bad remnants of the New Left, was this investment in youth as itself a revolutionary force, as if capitalism itself is progressive, you know, just through sexual reproduction. You know, that just isn't enough. So anyway, that's my final comment. But yeah, we shouldn't count ourselves, and when we count the number of people in the room, I'm the first one who needs to learn that.
So Doug, when I was at Hampshire College in the late 80s, early 90s, it must have been the early 90s, there was a zine. It was a fanzine of Judith Butler called Judy. And I used to call her Judy Bats. That was based on the zine title. I came up with my own nickname for Judith Butler, Judy Bats, because that harks back to the 50s, right? And you know, the sexism, right, that the 60s rebelled against. Anyway, yeah, zines. I always thought zines sucked. I always thought that zines were kind of shitty. I guess the one advantage of zines is that they can't be canceled as easily, right? Is that if you got print media, you know, it's harder to digitally erase, right? Whereas the online stuff, you can go down the memory hole, you can have your existence canceled pretty easily. I mean, in terms of, you know, I think that, you know, an unfortunate thing that's taken place in the dynamics of the discussion with respect to Dennis and me, in that, you know, I think Platypus got kind of pigeonholed as idealist and only caring about theory and consciousness. And, you know, in helping start Platypus early on with my students, you know, I made a choice. which is to say, I'm probably not going to be able to do much organizing the workers, given my position in society, given the state of the working class, given all sorts of factors. But one thing I can do is make an intellectual intervention. And the left mostly exists at the level of ideas, and mostly at the level of miseducating people at the level of ideas. And so I can perform a negative function, which is to say, you know, what the left says, that's not the idea, actually. That's a kind of a bad idea. But otherwise, of course, I know that what has to happen is for, you know, the working class to actually organize itself in all sorts of ways, not just in trade union struggles, not just as employees in a labor contract, but in all sorts of ways. They need to organize themselves into a social force and a political force, ultimately. But I also knew my own limitations. I'm a college professor. I also took a long break from the left in the 90s and in the early zeros. And when I came back to it, I was in my late 30s, and platypus kind of offered itself as a way of intervening. And I said to myself, you know, probably got another 10 or 20 years to do something. What can I actually do in that time? What can I do? I can do this, right? And maybe it's to leave an esoteric, a very esoteric kind of, beguiling, kind of mysterious, like indecipherable set of ideas there. Something to figure out, something for the future and generations to figure out. That's the flashing post, right? The messages in the bottle. The Frankfurt School did that too. But it's an acknowledgement that that's part of the story. It's not the whole story, but it's part of the story. So I would never say that that's going to decide everything. But I would say, if we forget that the workers' struggle within capitalism and for socialism is self-contradictory, if we forget that revolution and counter-revolution are inextricably tied, if we forget that capitalism is more revolutionary than we are, objectively, and we're always catching up with it in trying to overcome it, we're still trying to catch up with it. If we forget the dialectic, I don't think there's the self-consciousness necessary when the rubber hits the road will really get us beyond capitalism. In other words, I don't know that there's a relevance to critical theory today, right, politically. I don't think that critical theory is particularly needed politically today. I don't think that organizing workers means like you need some ideas from Lukács and Adorno or Marx for that matter. You don't. You really don't. You don't need to be a Marxist to fight against oppression and exploitation and to organize the workers as a social and political force. But at some point, it will be necessary. And my concern has always been that these ideas will just be lost. In other words, that they will disappear because they can, and they have, and they do. And they get rediscovered, kind of, but it's very fragile, very thin, very brief. It's of a moment. And again, that doesn't mean like idealism versus materialism. It just means there were some dearly bought ideas paid for by a history of suffering the last 200 years. I don't think those can be afforded to be lost entirely, right? And so it's not the be all end all, it's not, but it's necessary. Not sufficient, but necessary.
Okay, on that note, I think we'll have to call it quits. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to everyone who attended. Our next public fora will be on April 9th, Friday, the Death of the Millennial Left. And for Platypus contacts and members, there'll be a post-panel chat that will be shared. The link will be shared shortly. So once again, thanks everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all. Bye-bye.